Okay, thank you so much for all of you coming to the launch of Young People and the Constitution. My name's James Forward. I am the project manager of the Constitution Society. So, very briefly, the Constitution Society was set up in 2009, and it was set up with the explicit purpose of trying to educate, inform, and promote discussion on constitutional issues. We don't have a particular axe to grind, we don't particularly value one electoral system over another or reform of a chamber over another, but what we do really stress is that there's a good process, so things are thought out quite well. We submit evidence to the Political and Constitutional Reform Committee, we run the all-party parliamentary group on the British Constitution, and we also publish pamphlets, some of which you will see on your seats, on such topics as select committees and their powers and parliamentary privilege. The other offshoot of what we do is obviously educational, and that's why you're here tonight. Young People in the Constitution is really an effort on our part to engage with the future MPs, the future peers perhaps, the future journalists, civil servants, people who will be making the decisions in the future that our current parliamentarians are making today. And we're really keen that people understand the arms of the state in Britain and also understand the British Constitution. So I'd just like to say a very big thank you to the European Parliament for hosting us here. It's very kind of them. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Mr. Speaker for taking some very precious time out of his very busy schedule to join us. And I'd like to say thank you to all of you for coming across the country as well. If you do tweet, the hashtag is YPC, Young People in the Constitution. We're going to try and get that trending so constitutional issues get out there. We'll try incremental change. And also just to quickly let you know as well that our next event will be on July the 18th, and that's going to be quite topical if you look at the papers today on Europe and the European Parliament and its impact on the British Constitution as well. There will be questions after this session, so please do think of them now. I'll be chairing and taking in rounds of 3. So without any further ado, give a very warm welcome, please, to the Right Honourable John Bercow MP, Mr. Speaker of the House of Commons. Thank you.
James, thank you for the warmth of that welcome and introduction, and congratulations to you and all associated with you on the foundation of the Constitution Society and that theme of young people and the Constitution, though in the minds of some perhaps an arid one, is at least equal in importance to aridity. It's absolutely fundamental that young people have some awareness of, and preferably interest in, welcome, come in, the water is warm, the Constitution, because the way in which we're governed, the decisions that are made as to the allocation of resources, the policy options that are chosen, the kind of legislation that we have, will all ultimately affect you in the pursuit of your lives, whether you like it or not. And therefore it's a point that I commonly make in schools, not least to primary school children, let alone to secondary school children, that although you might profess a disinterest in or even an aversion to politics, you cannot, I'm afraid, credibly say that it simply won't affect you. You can argue a case that they're all rather similar, and we don't think we've got a good choice, and we think it could be a whole lot better, and all of those propositions can be argued, but the argument that says, well, it just won't affect me, is, if you'll forgive me saying so, simply not valid, because politics in the end isn't actually about pursuited individuals or people who hold high office. Politics is about the arbitration between conflicting interests, the means by which conflicts and disputes are resolved, and the mechanism through which policy is decided upon and implemented, and that will affect you. And recently, if it's of interest to you to know, I went to a primary school in southeast London in Lewisham as part of an away day, and it's something I do very regularly, and I asked the children who had been primed to an extent for the fact of the visit, how many of them, hands up, were interested in politics, and very few hands went up. And then I did ask them the following questions: how many of you are interested in the sort of job you will get after you leave school or university? And several hands went up. How many of you are interested in whether, and if so, when and to what quality you can get healthcare if you're sick? And lots of hands went up. And how many of you are interested in what we do to try to mitigate the plight of the poorest people on the face of the planet through aid, debt relief, trade, etc.? And virtually every hand went up, a commentary on the renowned and welcome internationalism of today's school students, perhaps by contrast with those of an earlier generation. So actually I said to them, well, you may not think you're interested in politics, but you are interested in what politics in the end is about. Before I say anything about my own role, and I want to make 3 points in relation to it, I should perhaps treat at the outset of one quite sensitive matter, which I think your natural courtesy as members of, or people interested in the Constitution Society, would disincline you to raise with me directly, but which, if unaddressed, will lurk, from my point of view, perilously in the undergrowth, and which I judge therefore needs to be knocked on the head at the outset. And that is the sensitive matter of height. Very specifically, it is frequently suggested, almost pervasively so in some of the more downmarket parts of the newspapers, that I am the shortest man ever to be Speaker. Now, I am as intensely relaxed about being short as Peter Mandelson once said New Labour was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. I have always been short, I'm 50 years old and I remain short, and given the known impact of the ageing process on physiognomy, the overwhelming likelihood is that I shall become inexorably and irrevocably shorter. And it doesn't bother me a jot, but historical accuracy does, and simply as a matter of historical fact, it's quite wrong when some of these scribblers say, well, Bercow is the shortest man to hold the office. You would expect the Speaker, for goodness sake, people like you who are interested in the Constitution, to have done his research. In that respect, I hope, if in no other, I shall not disappoint you. I have done. And as I say, it's a myth that I'm the shortest man to hold the office. Sir John Bussey, Speaker of the House, from 1394 to 1398. Sir John Wenlock, Speaker of the House, from 1455 to 1456. And Sir Thomas Tresham, Speaker of the House, in 1459, are all believed to have been shorter than I am, although I do have to admit that this was true only after all three of them had been beheaded. Indeed, no fewer than 7 of my predecessors met their end on the executioner's table. One was killed in battle, and a further poor unfortunate soul was brutally murdered. So you will understand, colleagues, that this does enable me to view the present woes and challenges which afflict and confront the House of Commons with an appropriate sense of historical proportion. That is to say, whatever else happens to me, I'm not likely to lose my head. Now, I'd like, if I may, to make 3 points to you. The first relates to the role of the Speaker in the chair, the second to the process of reform in the House of Commons, and the third to the function of the Speaker as an ambassador for Parliament, and I hope a robust advocate of democratic politics. First of all, let me briefly treat of the role of the Speaker in the chair. I think it has already been indicated to you, in case you were not already aware, that in the British system, as distinct from many systems around the world, including many democracies, the Speaker is and is required to be an impartial figure who, upon election, thereafter permanently eschews party politics. The Speaker renounces his or her affiliation, literally by ceasing to be a member of a political party, and is expected to take up the role not of player, but of referee or umpire. Now, I'm not arguing that speakers in other countries where there is no requirement to abandon party are somehow biased. It doesn't necessarily follow that they are at all, and many of them, in fact most of them no doubt, do an excellent job. But it is very deeply rooted in the British parliamentary psyche that the House wants the Speaker to be and to be seen to be impartial, and the best way to underscore or guarantee that impartiality is to say the Speaker will take no further part in his or her previous party and certainly wouldn't get involved in any other. So if I am involved in party at all, which I am not, it would be now as leader of the Good Order and Fair Play party, if I can put it that way. I'm not a participant, I'm not trying to score goals or runs, if you're a cricketer, for one side or the other, the government side or the opposition side. What I'm there to do is to referee or umpire the contest, in which capacity I am perhaps also analogous to the referee of a football match in another sense, or to the head teacher of a school, because I'm there to keep order, to encourage people to take part, ask their questions, make interventions, deliver speeches, and to try to cut down on the number of people who have to be excluded altogether as a result of bad behaviour. And day to day, my main function is to facilitate the flow of business and to try to maximise the participation in the proceedings of the House in terms of the number and range of people who can be called to ask questions or make speeches. How does that work? Well, as far as question time is concerned, members submit questions in advance. There is a ballot, and so certain people are drawn out of the ballot and are guaranteed to be called. Whether I want to hear them or not is neither here nor there. They have to be called, and if you're in the top 15 or 16 in the course of the hour for question time, you will have a chance to contribute. But there are other people who constantly stand. If you ever watch parliamentary television, you'll see people standing, and quite a lot of people who don't know about Parliament or don't know the detail of how it operates say to me, John, why are all those people standing up all the time? And the answer is that standing up is the equivalent in Parliament of a student in a classroom or a person at a public meeting putting up his or her hand if that person wishes to ask a question or to make a speech. In other words, people are standing because they're trying to catch the speaker's eye. They're signalling to the speaker a desire to contribute to the discussion that is taking place. And my role is to go back and forth from one side of the House to the other and to try to call as many people as possible. So obviously I have to know the name of every member and his or her party, and preferably his or her constituency. And there are 650 of them, so 400 plus of them I knew already. After the last election there were 227 new members. So from the new book published with pictures and names of new members, done very efficiently by House of Commons officials within hours of the result of the election being declared, I have to learn who those people are. And then I'm looking to call people who were elected 50 years ago or 3 months ago, because they're both MPs, they're both paid by the taxpayer, they've both got a right to contribute, and arguably a duty to do so. I'm looking to call women who on the whole are better behaved and less raucous than the men, as well as men. I'm looking to call people from England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and people from different parts of those countries. And I'm looking to call people with different opinions. So, for example, on some of the great controversies that are controversies not just between but within political parties, it's up to the Speaker. It's part of the job description almost of the Speaker to know roughly where people stand. So on Europe, for example, I know, of course, on the Conservative side, Bill Cash and John Redwood are very, very, very strong Eurosceptics. But on the other hand, I know that somebody like Bob Walter, who is not as well known a Conservative MP, but a Conservative MP in Dorset, or Neil Carmichael, who's a Conservative MP in Stroud, in Gloucestershire, are very pro-European. And on the Labour side, I know that Keith Vaz and Peter Hain, or Chris Bryant, are very strong pro-Europeans on the Labour benches, but Kelvin Hopkins, Gisela Stewart, John Cryer, Kate Hoey, Frank Field are examples of very Eurosceptic Labour MPs. And this applies in other disputes as well, Israel-Palestine, and on the subject of nuclear energy, and a range of other matters. It's up to the Speaker to know where people stand and to try to ensure a balanced expression of opinion in the course of the debate. Can I please everybody? What are those pigs I see flying in front of my very eyes? Of course I can't, because there will always be people who think that they should speak in every debate and who think that no debate could not be improved by a contribution from them, and they're disappointed if they're not called and so on. But I'm trying to be fair, that's all. That's the only motivation. There are always people who sometimes think that the speaker has got a preference for one person over another. The speaker doesn't have special favourites or people that he regards as to be prevented from speaking. It's just not proper to work like that, and the speaker doesn't work like that. The speaker tries to ensure that everybody gets a fair opportunity to contribute. But obviously where there are limitations of time, you can't necessarily include everybody. Where a lot of people want to speak in a debate, we usually impose a time limit, which has happened today, and that way we maximise the number of contributors, but even so, some people perhaps don't get called. So that is my main role, and it also is why, because I need to avoid any accusation as far as I can that I'm leaning to one side or the other, I tend not to express views on controversial matters in the chamber. I don't all that often express views on controversial matters outside the chamber, but I am of course a constituency MP as well, so if a constituent writes to me and asks me what do I think about equal marriage, then I explain that I won't vote because the speaker doesn't vote unless there's a tie, which very rarely happens, hasn't happened in my time. But I will tell them what I think. I will say, well, personally I'm in favour of it for the following reasons. I must be honest with you and explain that I don't vote in the matter, but if you want me to take up your view with the Minister, I will, and if you're asking me my view, that is my personal view. The second point I wanted to make to you is that at various times in our parliamentary history, there has been an impetus for reform in the House of Commons, or indeed the House of Lords, and at other times there's been no real appetite for reform at all, and the expectation has been that the Speaker will simply hold fort, if you like, hold the ring, hold to the administration, if you will, of the status quo, but there's no great desire for anything much to change. We are at the moment in a period in which there is a very considerable appetite for change, which I would argue got underway, started to take root around the time of the expenses scandal. And when my predecessor stepped down as Speaker, there had to be a contest to elect a successor, and I was one of 10 candidates, and we had, I think, a really good, nourishing debate for about a month about who should be Speaker, but also what sort of direction the House should take. And I remember making the argument to my colleagues in hustings meetings and elsewhere that if anybody seriously thought that the only thing that was causing public disaffection with Parliament was the expenses scandal, they were frankly deluded on an industrial scale. Yes, there was a real problem with an overly generous, excessively secretive, patently indefensible expenses system which we needed to replace with one characterised by equity, transparency, audit and accountability. But we needed to do much more than that if we were to tackle public disillusionment with and sometimes even contempt for politicians and the political class. And I said to colleagues, sure, if I'm elected, I will do such as the Speaker is required to assist the process of bringing about a new expenses system, which we now have, which is independent of the House, independently conceived, independently operated, independently reviewed. But I put it to colleagues, we need to go a whole lot further. It is completely ridiculous that ministers keep making key policy announcements outside Parliament first, through leaks to journalists or interviews on the Today programme when they should be announced in the House, and explained and defended to members and subject to questioning by members. And if you elect me, I propose to insist upon statements to the House, and where ministers don't offer statements when they should, not necessarily because of any grave impropriety on their part, but because I think they've made the wrong judgment in choosing not to offer a statement to the House, I will revive and resuscitate the urgent question procedure, capital U, capital Q. It's a feature of our standing orders, whereby any member can write to the Speaker and ask for permission urgently to question a minister on a subject that has just arisen. And that way you will get the chance to probe, scrutinise, challenge, contradict, even now and again expose ministers as appropriate, and it will help to underscore the importance and centrality of the chamber as a forum for debate, inquisition and scrutiny. Now, whether I'm any good as Speaker is not for me to say, that's for you and other people to judge, but I have sought to discharge my obligation and to redeem that pledge. We actually have had rather more statements from ministers volunteered in recent years, but we've also had a massive increase in the number of urgent questions granted. In the year before I was elected, there were 2 allowed by the Speaker. My first year, I think there were 24. And over the last just under 4 years, we've had, I think it's now 138 urgent questions put to ministers, which has meant that a minister at short notice has had to rearrange his or her schedule and to come to the House to explain his or her policy. You understand, this isn't the Speaker saying the policy is right, or the Speaker saying the policy is wrong. That's not for the Speaker to say. This is a question of the Speaker saying this is a matter which ought to engage the interest and attention of the House of Commons today. And the Minister, whatever else he or she has to do, must put it on hold because he or she must discharge duty to the House by coming and explaining him or herself. So this is quite a testing chill wind so far as the Minister is concerned, but it, if you like, underlines the point that the Minister's got power and the red box and the ministerial car and the higher salary and all of that to which he or she is entitled, but above all the Minister owes a duty to Parliament, and that duty cannot be relegated below any other priority. I also said I thought it was completely ridiculous that the chairs of the key select committees that scrutinise the work of the executive branch of our political system, that is to say government departments, were hand-picked by representatives of that executive branch, because until 2010 select committee chairs were basically appointed at the behest of government and opposition whips. It was a prize for good behaviour, and denial of a chairmanship was in a sense a penalty for bad or for voting against the party or whatever. And I said, well, surely the House should decide whether, as I favour, it wants in future the chairs of select committees to be elected by secret ballot of the whole House. And I wasn't the only candidate to argue that, but I think I was pretty much first out of the blocks in arguing that case. That too has now happened. At the start of this Parliament in 2010, all the key select committee chairs were elected by secret ballot of the whole House. I said, I think my own deputies should be elected by secret ballot. There's nothing wrong with the deputies that had previously served me and had been appointed by their parties, but they've not got the sanction, they've not had conferred upon them the legitimacy, credibility of being chosen by the House. Now the 3 deputies have all been elected by the House and, well, I think, strengthened as a result. I said I think that, frankly, we ought to have more days of parliamentary business in which the timetable and choice of subject is determined by backbenchers, not by the government, and we ought to have a backbench business committee set up. That was set up at the start of this Parliament and very ably chaired by the Labour member for North East Derbyshire, Natasha Ingle, and has staged debates over the last 3 years on all sorts of subjects of interest and importance, sometimes triggered by e-petition or other petition from constituents, but which wouldn't have been chosen by the government today, and sometimes wouldn't even have been chosen by the opposition front bench. So it's the House taking ownership of its own affairs, demanding the presence of a minister to reply, and in some cases passing resolutions that lead to policy change. Off the top of my head, I can think of 2 that were significant. The Backbench Business Committee debate on whether to have a referendum on EU membership undoubtedly led eventually to the Conservative Party making a referendum commitment. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or not is a matter of political opinion, but what I'm trying to demonstrate to you is that the Backbench Business Committee started a ball rolling that ultimately did lead to a notable change in policy. So whatever you think of the Backbench Business Committee debate or vote on that particular matter, it was effective in the sense that it influenced the course of events. Similarly, the debate that took place on whether to ban the use of wild animals in circuses was effective because the House resolved that there should be such a ban. The government had been rather resisting it for reasons that it thought were legally necessary, but the government has now committed to the implementation of the ban by 2015. And I think one would fairly conclude that Mark Pritchard's initiative as a Conservative member in pushing for the debate on that subject was successful. The government wanted to change the terms of the debate with what I call a wrecking amendment that would have effectively neutered altogether Mark's motion. And I decided not to select the government amendment because I thought let the House of Commons vote on the motion which is very clear. It's not full of obfuscation. It's a very clear motion saying, basically, this House instructs the government to bring forward a ban on the use of wild animals in circumstances. It's very clear. And I thought, well, if the government doesn't like it, the government can encourage its MPs to vote against it. In the end, there was no division, no vote. And I think this was probably because the government realised that if there were a vote, it would lose it. But it was, I say this not to my credit, but to Mark's, it was to Mark Pritchard's credit that he brought that subject forward. He felt strongly about it. And as I say, it has spawned a notable movement and hastening of policy that might otherwise not have resulted. I think we still need a House Business Committee to schedule all parliamentary business. So I don't think we're at the end of the reform curve by any means, but we are in a period of significant and perhaps zealous reform, which in my opinion is to the benefit of the House, of the quality of scrutiny, of the topicality of debate, and therefore of the relevance of the chamber. The last point I want to make to you is that when I stood for election as Speaker, I basically took the attitude, well, let's keep the best and improve the rest. In other words, I'm not somebody who believes in changing everything on the basis of some abstract principle that says that there's a better way of doing a thing from scratch. I think there's a lot to be said for preserving what has stood the test of time and what has been shown to be effective. Some of our traditions have been extremely valuable, and let's preserve them. But on the other hand, the role of Speaker, no more than the functioning of the House, should be cast in aspic. Everything is capable of change, preferably evolutionary change in my view, but change nevertheless. And I said to colleagues, look, if you elect me, I'll chair in the chamber, I'll greet visitors from around the world, which in the most notable cases involve meeting, greeting, welcoming and introducing President Obama, the Pope and Aung San Suu Kyi. And on a much smaller scale, it means meeting people pretty well every week in my rooms from different countries. I met the Ghanaian speaker this morning, and no doubt all the others later in the week. I'll do those, and I'll chair the House of Commons Commission, which is responsible for the staff, services and property of the parliamentary estate. But I would like to suggest there should be a fourth function, and that is for the Speaker, as I signalled earlier, to act as an ambassador for Parliament on a non-partisan basis, not partisan about a party, but partisan about the merits of the House, democracy, and the chamber, and a robust advocate of the democratic political process. Now, when I first suggested this, that perhaps the Speaker might get out a bit, visit schools, colleges, be a public advocate, there was a little bit of a frisson in the air, because colleagues, in some cases, were very traditional. And one of my distinguished colleagues, who's no longer a member of the House of Commons, said, he was obviously completely shocked, I'm bound to say, colleagues, he was putting himself forward for election to the chair, that I have witnessed, and with increasing concern, nay, alarm, in recent weeks, my honourable friend, the member for Buckingham, arguing the thesis that the Speaker should serve as an ambassador for Parliament. I would wish to say in all candour and charity to my honourable friend that I think if the Speaker were to undertake regular interviews upon Sky News, pontificating upon matters of political controversy, it would be profoundly injurious to the reputation of Parliament. And I said to him, Patrick, if I had been suggesting that, you would be justified in criticising me, but I was not, and therefore you are not. I was never suggesting for one moment that the Speaker should be so stupid as to get drawn into great arguments about the health service or the economy or education policy and pop up on news programmes taking sides between one party and another. That would be a crazy thing for the Speaker to do. What I was simply arguing is that there is a role within limits for the Speaker to cease to be incarcerated within the portals of the Palace of Westminster and instead to get out a bit and make a case for Parliament and the political class and what we're doing and how we operate and why the political process matters and in what way people can get involved and seek to shape or change it. And that is what I have done. And as I say, there was some resistance to this. Another of my senior colleagues came up to me some months later and he said, I didn't vote for you. I didn't vote for you. Mr. Speaker, if I may say so, I voted for Sir George Young, I think he's a bloody good egg. I didn't vote for you. But I think we're doing frightfully well, if I may say so. I think we're doing a jolly good job on the chair. So well done. But I would just like to make I didn't get this point about outreach. You call it outreach, sort of going out and visiting schools and so forth. I don't get it, and I said, well, what don't you get? And he said, well, he thought it was a rum business. And I said, what do you mean it's a rum business? And it took quite a long time to extract from him in meaningful and coherent terms what exactly the gravamen of his objection was. And in the end, he said basically he thought it was beneath the dignity of the Speaker. The Speaker was a very historic role, a very important function, celebrated office, and it was beneath the dignity of the Speaker of the House of Commons to go around talking to audiences. Dare I say it, people would probably have thought it beneath the dignity of the Speaker to speak to this audience. And I said to him, in all candour, that I respected him being very upfront with me, because he wasn't unpleasant about it, it was just his opinion, and he's entitled to his opinion. I said, I respect you being upfront, not saying it behind my back but to my face, but I completely disagree with you, because I think that in the modern age, if we're to get and keep respect for key institutions and offices, it just doesn't work anymore for people to dress up in fancy costumes and look important. You've got to be prepared to get out and engage with the people who pay your salary. And that's all I'm trying to do. And it's hugely stimulating in the process to meet thousands over the years of young people across the country. And I go and speak to a lot of university of the third age audiences, somewhat older gatherings of mature citizens, and simply to have a discussion about politics and Parliament and the political process. So that's what I'm doing. Tonight's been another good opportunity. Whatever you want to do, I wish you great success in your careers, whether it's as politicians or as policy advisors or as civil servants or in academe or journalism or working in the service of the House. And I hope that, buttressed by your qualifications and life experience, you're lucky enough, because I think this is the key thing, to do something for a living which you enjoy. Because, you know, when you think about it, I know it's a very trite observation, but it is valid. We spend a third of our lives at work until we either retire or die. And of course it's great to earn a very good salary and have all the material satisfaction that that can bring. But it is, I think, great if you can enjoy it. And I know people, as probably you do, at both ends of the income spectrum, who do jobs that they don't enjoy but they have to do to get by, to pay the bills, to make a living. And I count myself very lucky to be doing two jobs, really, as Member of Parliament for Buckingham and as Speaker, that I find incredibly rewarding. So I have no plans to die tomorrow, but if I were to die tomorrow, I would die a happy person, feeling that I've been very lucky. And the good fortune I've had, I wish for you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to use this because I can't quite project as well as you can. There will be time now for questions from the floor, but I thought just before that I'd ask a quick question,
Please.
if I may, which is, I think you brought to light something that lots of people often don't consider with the Speaker's role, which is that dual role of constituency MP as well as Speaker of the House of Commons. With that in light, I mean, how hard is neutrality when you've had that transition from party politics through climbing through the ranks of political parties, being selected, being elected, and then putting that aside, and then also maintaining that, but nonetheless having a voice for your constituents as well?
That's a very good question. In terms of in the chamber, do I find it difficult? Basically, no, because of two things. First of all, for 4 years before I was elected Speaker, I sat on the panel of the previous Speaker, the so-called Speaker's Panel of Chairmen. I have such a panel now. And the Speaker's Panel of Chairmen is made up of people who chair debates in the second chamber of Parliament, by which I don't mean the House of Lords, I mean the second chamber in the Commons, which is Westminster Hall, where there's a semicircular or sort of horseshoe chamber where a number of debates take place, usually on slightly less controversial and constituency-related matters. And members of the Chairman's panel, the Speaker's Panel of Chairmen, chair there, and they chair committees upstairs, legislation committees, and I did that for 4 years, so I got used to the neutral role. The other reason why it wasn't difficult for me to adjust was that for years, although I remained a Conservative member, and I never wanted to be a member of any other political party but the Conservative Party,
I did work with members from all parties on matters of interest to me, especially educational needs provision, constitutional reform, LGBT equality, the fight against global poverty and so on. So I was used to mixing shop with other Conservatives, but also with members from other parties, and I personally found quite a lot of that work very rewarding. I spent some time undertaking a whole review of speech and language services across the country with recommendations to government, and that was a very stimulating exercise, but it wasn't a party political one. So I had sort of become fairly bored with the knockabout stuff anyway, and so it wasn't such a great transition. The other thing is it's just a matter of professionalism. You know, in the chair, you've just got to keep your opinions to yourself and just facilitate the debate. In terms, however, of representing the constituency, you know, it's a very fair point. Well, how can you do that if you're not expressing views? And I would say in answer to that, really, I represent constituents through correspondence with ministers and outside agencies, Charles Ford Agency, Environment Agency, Inland Revenue, and so on. And if necessary, in meetings. One thing I have found is that I get much quicker replies to my letters to ministers now than I used to get before I was elected Speaker. I get rather more letters from Secretaries of State, which on the whole constituents quite like, to think that they've got a reply from the Secretary of State. It may well be that the content isn't any different from what it would be if it was signed by a junior minister, but people feel quite pleased that if they've written about something relating to, say, work and pensions, the reply they get is from a minister whose name they know, Ian Duncan Smith, rather than a junior minister. And that is what now happens on a much bigger scale. I also find that if I ask to see a minister, the minister comes to see me in Speaker's House. And that, colleagues, is in recognition both of the centrality, the importance of the role of Speaker in our arrangements. I always say I'm not important, and other, you know, I hope to my wife and 3 children. But the office of Speaker is important in our constitutional arrangements. In recognition of that and of the fact that the Speaker doesn't speak in debates, basically if you want to see a minister, the minister comes to see you. The minister comes to see me in Speaker's House, and I've had loads of ministers in Speaker's House to see me about matters that affect constituents. Not normally about Mrs Higgins' drain, no disrespect to Mrs Higgins' drain, but I would normally ask to see a minister on an issue that affected a significant number of people, whether it be a wind farm proposal in my constituency or High Speed 2, which is going to impact upon Buckingham or whatever. So there is an argument about whether it's right that at election time the major parties don't stand against the Speaker, and some people think that's unfair, that constituents are prevented from having a party choice and so on, although other people do stand against the Speaker, but the main parties tend not to do so. And that I accept is an issue that can be argued over. What I don't accept is that somehow, oh well, the Speaker's now neutered, the Speaker can't do anything, but actually, as I say, I get quicker replies, I find it much easier to get meetings with ministers. In some cases I have been able to bring about very beneficial changes to constituents. And so, you know, the idea that the Speaker's toothless is frankly nonsense.
Great, thank you. And are there any questions now from the floor? What I think we'll do is we'll take them in rounds of 3. So if we take 3, and then Mr. Speaker will answer. So just the gentleman here.
Firstly, thank you for an excellent talk, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
I'd like to inquire upon perhaps a more divisive issue, but nonetheless very pressing, especially considering where we are. Should the UK remain in the European Union?
Right.
Are there any other questions? The lady there.
Oh, I probably don't need a microphone. I was just going to ask what you thought about the state of democracy in Britain today, because the way I see it, there is almost a dichotomy between people pushing for like the little man to have a voice and, you know, bring down the bankers and let's occupy, and then also there's the government who always whips backbenchers into party line, which denies them being able to give their constituents a voice. And just as you said with the circus animals, I was working in Parliament at the time when that bill went through the House, and the feeling was that, well, that's the end of his career then, he'll never get a place in the cabinet.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's just all I wanted to ask.
May I ask, who were you working for at the time?
I was working for the member for Henley, which is John Howell.
Oh, John Howell, yeah, sure, yeah, a very good and respected member, yeah, okay.
And the gentleman down here as well, please. Just wait for the microphone. It's not so much for projection, it's also just so it's recorded as well, but no, you were very loud, so you're fine.
Thank you, Madam Speaker from UK. There are 3 questions in one.
God. Right.
As you know that we have got the Family Law Act, which was passed by maybe in 1985. That was an amendment where you find that the UK should define sex at birth. Then there is a draconian, there is a lacuna that you as a speaker you have not resolved, because me as an academician in PhD, there's a question when you talk about same sex, and we have not defined what is sex according to the birth certificate that I see, because I was born in Uganda in 1984, and when I came here, we know that sex is determined by birth according to which passport. Now we are seeing amendment of a new sex. You have not amended about the birth certificate. Two, when you go to marriage, the definition of marriage has been left for the last years, that marriage is between two opposite sex. Thirdly, you have not also resolved the issue of adultery. So if I'm a person, a lawyer, an academician, how can I help the divorce proceedings for a gay person? Because for one to be an adultery, one has to be sex of an opposite position, then this can be alleged as one of the grounds for divorce. So, if two sex people are married, when are they going to commit or bring a proceedings in the arena about divorce? The other issue that is also very paramount, that people will see it as a demeanor or a question of not of respect. You said that you always like the good things to remain, then change where possible.
Yeah, yeah.
Wouldn't you see that England being a region whereby we have the Queen in England, and there is a quotation from the Bible about procreation, and aren't we fighting that diminution? And then, as a speaker, what are some of your solutions?
Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
I mean,
thank you.
if we could try and keep it relatively constitutional, Ireland is having a constitutional convention on same-sex marriage, but it's not a constitutional issue in the UK. But if Mr. Speaker would like to,
Okay. All right. Well,
those
thank
points.
you. First of all, colleagues, thank you very much for your questions. On the first question about the European Union, I can say really only that as a matter of record, I said a matter of a couple of months ago when I was speaking in Lithuania at the University of Vilnius, that when push came to shove, my hunch would be that the British people would wish to continue within the European Union. I express myself with a degree of caution because I'm not generally going around making speeches on Europe, and I want to say what I say with respect to people of different opinions. This is classically a highly toxic political issue, high octane, and which does divide the parties. But I would simply make the point that although at the moment there is widespread opposition to British membership of the European Union, and more particularly certainly widespread criticism of the European Union, which is not quite the same thing as people actually wanting in the end to come out, my feeling is that if the matter is eventually put to a referendum in our form, even though at the moment you might think, well, people will vote to come out, I don't think that that would happen. I think that once the arguments are put seriously, if you find that for the sake of argument you've got major party leaders, and not just party leaders, but prominent and respected people in the major parties, making reasoned arguments for staying in, and you've got Mr. Farage and others, including some very fringe figures, saying, well, let's come out, I think that the argument for staying in will become increasingly attractive to people. Now, in the end, if there's a referendum, the people will decide. And
we shall see. I think in the end they will vote to stay in. I think a lot of people are fed up with the European Union, they're very critical of the European Union, they want a different relationship with the European Union, but I don't actually think people will vote to withdraw. And if you ask me, do I on the whole think we should stay in or not, I personally think, for reasons I won't bore you with at length, you know all the arguments about EU membership, I think that it is more sensible for Britain to remain a member of the European Union. Am I opposed to having a referendum? I'm not opposed to having a referendum. I can see some merit at some suitable point in having a referendum so that the public can decide on what is a constitutional issue where the major parties have basically always taken the same view. So I'm not unsympathetic to the idea that it should be resolved by referendum, but I think people should stay in. On the subject of the state of democracy, I just want to cavil a little bit at what you've said and take a slightly different view, because yes, of course, you're right that the political system is characterised by party, but in a modern democracy it would be unmanageable if there weren't parties. You couldn't just have really credibly a parliament of 650 completely independent individuals with no party programme. It would be a recipe for chaos in a modern state. So I welcome the party system, and yes, there have to be policies, and there has to be some level of discipline and organisation. But the one point I would like to make to you is that I think that what we've seen in recent years is both worthwhile reform in Parliament that has tended to help the backbench member against the government of the day, and what we've seen is a very substantial growth of independent-minded speaking and voting. In other words, when you sometimes hear it said, oh, well, of course, in the grand old days, there were lots of very honourable people who came to the House to express their independent views without fear or favour, but now you've just got these career politicians who are told what to do by the party whips. That, in fact, is totally contradicted by the evidence. First of all, there was never a golden age of Parliament, and all these great people, these independent-minded gentlemen, came to Parliament to speak their own minds. Most of them didn't come to Parliament very often at all. Most of them were busy looking after their estates or practising field sports, or you know, in their homes in West Indies or whatever. They very often weren't in Parliament at all, and some never spoke in decades. So that's the first point. The second point is that, as Philip Cowley's research at the University of Nottingham shows, dissent, backbench dissent within political parties, the incidence of rebellion is vastly greater now than it's ever been. In the 1950s, there were 2 whole sessions of Parliament when not a single Tory MP voted against the whip, and very few Labour MPs did so, and if they did, it was only on defence or foreign affairs, very rarely on domestic matters. Now you've got probably the most independent-minded cadre of newly elected members of Parliament in the House of Commons that I've seen in my political career. Last answer, and with great courtesy to the gentleman who asked the 3 questions in one, and I don't feel competent to treat all of them. You asked, you know, whether I had a solution or, you know, that I had failed to deal with this or that or the other. It actually, if I may very politely say so, not a matter for the Speaker to resolve the question of the content of the Family Act, or, you know, what the position is on adultery and what penalties there might be, or what would trigger divorce. Well, that isn't a matter for the Speaker, that's a matter for the House of Commons, and ultimately for the interpretation, those charged with the interpretation of the law. But insofar as you raise the issue of equal marriage, I respect your right to your view, sir, and I think it's important that debate in Parliament should respect the different views that exist. My own personal view is different to yours, and you quoted me saying, oh well, keep what works and improve the rest and don't change things for the sake of change. My own personal view is that in 2013 the principle of equality before the law for the LGBT community is a very important principle, and I do not myself see why, if 2 people of the same sex wish to make a commitment to each other of a lifelong character, they should not be able to do so through the institution of marriage. Now, I absolutely understand that may be offensive to you, but it is my honest view. You know, politicians are always accused of sitting on the fence and refusing to give straight answers to questions. I'm giving you a very straight answer, but that is my view. And I would just say that I did get letters. I did get letters from some constituents strongly arguing against, and I wrote back, much in the terms I'm answering you, by setting out my position as to why I thought it was desirable to change the law. And I said, I know this reply will disappoint you, but it is clear and honest, and we're always accused of sitting on the fence, so I hope you'll accept that I've been straight with you. I got one constituent who said to me, a man I knew actually, and rather liked, but I thought he was totally wrong. He wrote back to me and said, thank you for your reply, but he didn't find it convincing. He was totally against changing the law. And he said, John, I've been married for 38 years. Where do I go now? If Parliament is going to allow gay people to get married, where do I go now? And I wrote back to him and I said, Christopher, with the very greatest respect, you don't have to go anywhere. If you're happily married and you're enjoying your marriage, please go on and enjoy your marriage. But the happiness, the fulfilment, the enrichment of life that you derive from your marriage surely doesn't depend upon stopping other people getting married. But, and he said to me something like, you and Sally are no doubt happily married. And I said, yes, but, we are happily married, but our happy marriage doesn't depend on stopping other people getting married. So I understand there are religious arguments, involved in this matter, and there are people who take a very different view. But, for what it's worth, and I always take great care in parliamentary debate to ensure that people who are against gay marriage get a full opportunity to speak. They're treated absolutely equally, and that must be the duty of the speaker. But if you're asking me my view, I'm in favour of this change, and I believe in 5 years' time, people will say, what was all the fuss about?
Thank you very much. I know we've got very limited time now, so if you could is that okay? If you could have a kind of a speed round of people to maybe just ask some questions, and then we'll have some quite quick answers, I think. Let's have the lady there, please.
Hi. I was just wondering whether there might be a problem with your fourth new role as a speaker, because maybe parliamentary reform is only non-controversial now because maybe, or only a very small group care about parliament, whereas if you're successful and people do start to care about parliament, you might find yourself on one side of a very controversial issue about how power should be between the executive and the parliament.
Right, that's an interesting point.
And have the gentleman here, please.
Thank you very much. In fact, my question builds into the lady there. With the existence of such constitutional nightmares as the Shaker side in this case, and the continued use of such executive powers on behalf of the Queen, in inverted commas.
As the what case, sorry?
The Shaker Islanders case, the
Yes,
Bangkok,
yeah.
Is it a time for a proper separation of powers through a codified constitution? That all business.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Can I have the gentleman just there, please?
Thank you. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is, here in Britain, there's a long tradition of things working out fine, and from Hungary, and my question is, how would you, what were the suggestions how to create a tradition of a strong parliament, or like free parliament, where, for example, there's been puppet parliament in a way, so like there's no real tradition of, for example, the speaker having a role.
Where's that?
Hungary.
Okay.
Or most post-communist countries, to be honest.
Yeah.
So how would you go about to start generating a culture where, like, power of decision is not necessarily the only sort of institution?
Great, thank you. And can I have the lady in front here, please?
I have a question as to what extent do you think that within Parliament we have quality debate rather than just kind of exchanges between the Prime Minister and Miliband, and to what extent do you think that you could actually improve the quality of debate within Parliament?
Great, thank you. The gentleman there has been very patient.
Two questions, kind of rolled into one.
Could you make them very quick?
Very, very quick.
Thanks.
I work for an organisation that encourages young people to register to vote. And crucially, we realise that 40% of young people registered to vote in the last election. So in your role, what do you think the main challenges are in getting young people involved in the political process? And finally, there is a strong argument to make a voting age 16 years of age. So what do you think the main challenges are there? And do you agree with it? Should the voting age be 16?
That's great, thank you. And the gentleman there, please.
Thank you.
And I think that's going to be it.
At the University of York, and I'm doing my dissertation on parliamentary sovereignty.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, to what extent do you think that doctrine is relevant in our constitution today, given that judges have more power vis-a-vis the Human Rights Act, given that we have ceded sovereignty to Europe? Do you think the doctrine now just tends to be something on the mantelpiece that doesn't mean anything?
Something what, sorry?
Something that's just good decorative. You just say that our legislature their power. Do you think it's practical in the 21st century to have a doctrine that purports to invest absolute power in a legislature when we have decisions being made on global scale?
Great, thank you.
Okay. Right, let me have a crack at answering these. Some interesting questions. First of all, the question was put to me, well, did I not think that even if the role of the Speaker as an ambassador now is relatively accepted and uncontroversial, it might cease to be so accepted and uncontroversial if so many more people became interested in politics and perhaps had a strong view about the balance of power within Parliament, that I was, if you will, sort of dragged into a row as between the legislature and the executive. Well, I think what I would say to that is it's not impossible, but it would be quite a fortuitous development if we got to the point where there was so much interest ratcheted up that there were mass lobbies of people sort of saying, well, the Speaker has persuaded us that we should be pro-Parliament. And, you know, they were sort of delivering petitions to number 10, sort of saying, we back Parliament, we back the Speaker, we want change. Now, I'm slightly bastardising perhaps your question, but...
It's not that absurd. And also, it wouldn't have to be you.
No, okay. But the role of the Speaker, sure. But, you know, do I think that's very likely to happen anytime soon? I don't really think so. I think if that did develop, you know, if there were a sort of almost, if you like, a mass citizens movement demanding more parliamentary powers, say, well then I think my response is to say I have a general view about parliamentary power and scrutiny being important, but in the end the House will have to decide. So, you know, I mean, I favour the creation of a House Business Committee, and I make no secret of the fact that that's my view. But in the end, I don't have a vote in the matter. And, you know, would I, the night before a vote on such a matter, you know, make some explosive intervention in the debate? No, I think then it's a question of the Speaker judging whether to speak, and if so, when. And, you know, always it's a question of using one's judgment, because very few of these things are written down anywhere. It's a question of deciding, you know, what is reasonable and proportionate and safe and so on for the Speaker to do. So, could it arise? It could, but I think it's quite a long way off, and I don't think it's a reason not to try to develop greater interest in parliamentary activity. The question of whether we should have a codified constitution and a separation of powers, there are arguments for a codified constitution. And certainly, by the way, I think that one of the reasons why the House of Lords reform was destined not to go through was that although supporters of an elected second chamber said, oh well, you know, we still believe in the primacy of the first chamber, I think simply asserting it without codifying and delineating the powers was never going to satisfy the House of Commons. So there's some argument for codification, and certainly if you want a new arrangement with the Lords, I think you would probably need a codification of powers. Do I want a separation of powers as such? No. I mean, I know it operates in the United States and maybe successfully. I personally think it's actually a good feature of our system that ministers have to come to Parliament, that they sit in it, share some of its pressures, but are also accountable to backbenchers. So I personally wouldn't go down the American route of having people invested with great power who aren't formally part of the parliamentary process. I'm not saying their system is worse, I just think our system suits us, and I don't sense a huge appetite for change. How do we bring about change in countries where perhaps they have escaped the yoke of communist or other tyrannical control, but there isn't an embedded culture of democratic representation or pursuit? I suppose the answer is we do a certain amount through capacity building between our parliament and other parliaments. We're working, for example, with the Burmese at the moment to try to advise them on how they can develop a question time process, a concept of parliamentary committees that are independent of the government, etc., etc. And I think the Westminster Foundation for Democracy does quite a bit, but it is an ongoing challenge. It's not something that will change overnight. But I think the whole process of exchange between our country and Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on, should go on. And I often do visits like that, and I think they're worth doing. I'm going to Romania the week after next, I think it is, next week. And I think that, you know, it is a very proper role. If we're asked, we shouldn't poke our noses into people's affairs, but if we're asked,
then I think we should share intelligence and try to persuade others where we think we are doing something worthwhile of the merits of it, and maybe to learn some lessons ourselves in the process. In terms of the quality of debate and whether, you know, it is that good or I could help to make it better, I think what I would say is I think the quality of the debate, colleagues, between members of Parliament on most days of the week is actually very good. There are some excellent debates on all sorts of issues, whether it be the Constitution or mental health or engagement of young people or whatever. I think that Prime Minister's Question Time is massively unrepresentative of what happens in the House of Commons the rest of the week. But if you ask me, do I think the quality of debate is always great? I'm not going to comment really on the exchanges between Prime Minister and the opposition, but I think that where the decibel level exceeds anything of which the Damned would have dreamed in their heyday as one of the loudest bands in the world, that is bad for Parliament. We're spray painting our shop window, and I think it's negative. And I would say to colleagues, look, you can be passionate, you can have strong views, but orchestrated heckling is, I think, negative. All I could do is cut down on it and stamp on it when it happens. But if the party leaders told their MPs to stop behaving in that way, they would cut it out. So that would be my message today to David Cameron and Ed Miliband. Try to help me get it cut out. Should we do more to engage young people, and how? I think we can do a certain amount through physical activity, personal visits to schools and other institutions around the country. We use technology to try to get into schools. I'm encouraging Michael Gove to develop citizenship education because I think that that can play a role. And in answer to your question about the voting age, when I was free to hold and express an opinion about that controversial matter, I did argue in support of lowering the voting age to 16. Now that I'm no longer free to hold and express views on that rather controversial matter, I'm not minded to do so, but I leave you to speculate on whether the opinion enthusiastically articulated 4 years ago has suddenly, mystically changed. and I do work with young people at every turn in favour of them having maximum opportunity. Is finally the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty still relevant? I think it is. You're quite right that powers have been ceded to the European Union, and there is the question of judicial activism and the interpretation of the Human Rights Act, and of course there are all sorts of other institutions in a modern democracy that are very powerful, including global corporations and so on. Does that mean sovereignty is no longer relevant? I don't think it does. I think we have to accept there are all sorts of sources of power, but that doesn't necessarily mean that parliamentary sovereignty doesn't apply. You still have to take note of what happens in the financial markets and on a greater scale, and you have to take note of the impact of globalization and the capacity to shift jobs all over the world and so on.
Take the statute of Westminster, for instance.
Yeah.
Parliament repealed that and they take away the independence of New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. That's something, because the doctrine of Parliament sort of would imply that if Parliament chooses to repeal an act, like the statute of Westminster.
Yeah. Well, it may not apply in such a pure and undiluted form as it did, but I think that the idea that Parliament still is sovereign in a vast range of matters is valid, because no Parliament can find its successor, and there's still a very large range of policy matters over which Parliament can initiate and decide. And I don't want to get into too much of a debate with the UK Independence Party, but when you sometimes hear representatives of UKIP giving the impression that the vast majority of our laws have got very little to do with the British Parliament and are just sort of decreed by the EU, that really is a grotesque exaggeration. I know from my own day-to-day experience just how much the British Parliament can do. So, I mean, it may be quite an academic debate that we could have, but do I think that the concept of sovereignty has ceased to be of any relevance? No, I don't. I think it's still of enduring relevance.
Right, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker spoke at the start about his predecessors who'd been executed and had their heads chopped off. I think you might be liable to that if we keep you any longer, because I know that you've got an appointment you've got to get to. So thank you so much for spending so much time with us and speaking to our audience. Thank you.
Sorry to love you and leave you, because I genuinely would like to mix, but I'm hosting a dinner for young interns who, well, people on parliamentary placements, people from not fortunate or privileged backgrounds who want to work in the House.
and a number of whom have been doing so for several months. And there's a dinner for some of them plus their sponsors in Speaker's House. And it's to that end let's go.
Thank you very much. Right, very quickly, before we draw the session to a close, we've got a quick word from our colleagues in parliamentary outreach as well, while we have photos done as well, who is going to explain what parliamentary outreach does, what they can offer you in terms of helping you, in terms of getting engaged with our democratic process. And if you do want any more details, please do grab him at the end. So I'll just pass you over now.
Fantastic, thanks James. Thanks very much for coming along. I won't keep you too long. My name is Daniel Wood. I work for Parliament's Outreach Service, and what we do is we work with charities, colleges, universities, business networks, you name it, around the UK to promote Parliament's work and to get people more involved with it. We do have a separate school service as well. We're going to be working with James over the next few months on this project, and the thing to say, we've got some information on the work of the Outreach Service, and I've got some sign-up sheets, so if you want to keep up to date with what we're doing, whether you're based here in London or whether you've come from up north or the west or the south, we have regional offices that do training, information sessions, so do get in contact with us, but also do have a think about any aspects of Parliament's work that you want James and I to work on. We work with select committees, we work with members of the House of Lords as well, so do have a little bit to think about what's going to be of interest over the coming months. Feel free to have a chat with us. We've got some sign-up sheets and do get on our mailing list to be kept up to date with other events.
Thanks very much. And a big thank you to Parliamentary Outreach for helping us today, and the European Parliament Information Office as well, who've been absolutely excellent hosting us last minute when there's a room change as well. They've been wonderful. The European issue will be coming up quite shortly on July the 18th, and we'll be having a discussion on the role of the European Parliament in the British Constitution. It was touched on slightly today. We're going to go into a lot more detail. We thought it deserved a session in its own right. So I will be emailing everyone that's been in touch before about the next session and sending out the general mail out to you. Please do encourage your friends to come along. And if you need any information on parliamentary outreach, it's just here on the front table too. And last but not least, a big thank you to John Bercow for coming and joining us. Please take our reports as well. That will shed some light on some of the issues, particularly parliamentary sovereignty, that we've been looking at as well. So thanks so much for coming, and I hope to see you in the sessions. So thanks for coming to the launch of Young People and the Constitution. Thanks.